Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. Willis, he'd been home in Highgarden for the best part of several days, and he still didn't feel right as he sat in what had been Father's desk in Father's Solar. The table was piled high with all the business of the Reach and more. He had his duty to do to his lands and sworn banners, but he still felt ill at ease, as if he was an interloper. It doesn't feel like it's yours yet, does it? He looked up and smiled at grandmother, who was standing there, leaning on her cane and looking about the room herself. No, it does not. Your father felt the same after his own father, my dear Luther, died. He sat there with the same look on his face for some weeks afterwards. You'll get used to it, my boy. I swear you will. He sighed. When he'd forced father to go hunting, he'd run the Reach from his own rooms. Now that he was Lord Tyrell himself, he had to use the Solar. There was so much to do and organize, but I keep expecting him to wander in and complain about the latest insolence from Dorne or something. The words left his lips without thinking. Sorry, grandmother. She clacked her way to his side, using her cane, and then sat down next to him and patted his hand. Grief is like that, my boy. It settles over you like a dark blanket and keeps surprising you. I couldn't look at a pigeon pie for almost a year after your grandfather died without getting weepy. A certain path in the ground still makes me think of him. Little things will always make you recall people. Her eyes seemed to focus on something far away for a long moment. A terrible thing, grief. No parent should ever have to bury their child. But so many did. There was a long moment of shared sorrow, and then grandmother shook her head. Enough. Now, my boy, you have a lot of decisions to make. I know, he said grimly, and pointed at the reports to one side. The blight is gone, the crops are recovered, and we have a lot to do to make the most of the next harvest. The Coopers of the Reach are going to be busy and richer than many after all of this. The millers, too. Every scrap of land needs to be used where possible. And then the unused land made ready with fertilizer. A lot of dung needs to be flung. The more done now, the better, grandmother agreed. That Stark motto has never been more apt, she pursed her wrinkled lips. And speaking of sewing, you must marry, I know, he groaned. The business with Ned at the High Tower was too important for me to ignore, but now I must look at my options. Gods, that sounds cold-hearted, like I'm a prize bull at the market. I always wanted to find my own wife by falling in love, and now, grandmother patted his hand again, I know exactly how you feel. However, you must marry and quickly, because various dogs and foxes are circling. He eyed her. The Florence? Of course. Alistair Florent has never stopped whining about how unfair it all is that House Tyrell got Highgarden when House Florent had the better claim. Well, with the call still popping the earwax out of people's ears, he's probably telling people that House Florent is terribly first men in origin. Watch him carefully. Plus, Alekine and Delena Florent are on their way to Winterfell to visit young Edric. What a coincidence. Her voice was drier than the sands of Dorne. Luckily, Delena is married to Norcross, Willis sighed. Otherwise, she'd be on her way to Castle Black after that to meet the king. Grandmother nodded. The succession is still in the air. There's word that Soxley's Baratheon is pregnant again in Winterfell, and there's the other legitimized bastards to cloud everything. But if Edric becomes king, we need to be on guard in the future. So, options. He shuffled through a number of the proffered papers that grandmother had thrust into his hands. Tali. Too young, surely. Grandmother shrugged. Nonsense. Meredith Crane, the plump one. Cheerful, but fat. Delena Rowan, do I know her? Terribly pious. Oh, that one. Gods no. She probably thinks that children are spawned from under mulberry bushes or something. Possibly. Ella Ashford. 5 years younger than you, large breasts and possibly not a maid. Then why is she on the list? Major House and I did say possibly, but then you're not a virgin either. He looked at grandmother, who smiled sweetly at him. Yes, thank you for pointing out our hypocrisy. Jenna Kidwell, a year older than you, narrow hips, no sense of humor. He lowered the papers. Grandmother, your memory is excellent, but you seem to be steering me in but one direction. Grandmother looked at him and did not even blink for a long moment. I'm proud of you, my boy. He sighed. A raven to Horn Hill. Please ask me Lessa Tarley to come here with her daughter Tala Tarley, and a raven to the high tower to ask if Sir Sam Tarley can come here at once. We have much to discuss. Grandmother looked at him quizzically as she stood up. Such as... Euron Greyjoy broke through a lot of wards to reach the gate in the high tower. Given the fact that he seems to be insane, vindictive, and with knowledge of magic, I want to make sure that Highgarden and the high tower are well protected. Grandmother leant on her stick for a long moment, as she considered what he had said, her face pale. Good gods. Yes, quite right. I'll send the ravens myself. Marinere. It was good that the great temple of Volantis had so many doorways into its cavernous interior, because the time it took to climb down from a palanquin on the back of an elephant could be considerable, especially given that some worthies had brought their families. He folded his arms and glowered as the latest group of almost silver-haired members of the first families of Volantis swaggered through the doorway he was standing near, making sure that so many people in the gawking crowd could see them. This was not religion, this was an opportunity to strut like peacocks in front of the people and raise a profile or three. He did not care. He was not there to worship on that day. He was worried. He looked around. Still no sign. Marinar called out a jovial voice to one side, and he turned to see his old friend Jacaro Vonatis approaching, wife at his side. Are you waiting for your family? They're not coming, he said tersely, and his friend frowned as he saw the strain on his face. What's amiss? He beckoned them closer. I've told you of my youngest son, Tycho. Jacaro frowned. You hinted that he has dreams. Dragon dreams, we think. And last night he dreamt a dream that had him screaming in fear. A dream of today, this place, this time. Jacaro swapped a troubled look with his wife. Are you sure it was a dragon dream? He's what? 10? 11? 12, and these dreams keep coming. He dreamt that blood flowed from the doorways of the great temple, that a great darkness flowed over the temple itself, and that the sphinxes on its roof all screamed in warning. Jacaro's eyes widened, but it was his wife, Minola, who spoke next. Your son dreamt that the sphinxes screamed. I know. That's not possible, but it's happened before, she whispered. The statues of the sphinxes all screamed aloud on the day of the doom. But why? Yakakaro asked as he looked about the place. What could be wrong? Myrnor pulled a face and was about to shrug when a familiar face emerged from the temple at long last. Gierno, here! His brother hurried over, looking flustered. The first families are assembling in the pews, but you're right, there's something wrong. There's no sign of any of the Triarchs, even though they ordered the damn ceremony. No one's seen them for days, and for all the word of them being in conclave over a great decision, no one's seen them or their guards, or even heard from them. I talked to a priest who said that he'd heard one of them barking in order at someone in the temple earlier, but that there was something wrong with their voice, like they were muffled or something. I don't like it. His stomach turned over with deep unease, and he pulled a face. I don't like it either. We should alert someone. And tell them what? Yarano had a good point. You couldn't cancel a major religious ceremony based around a claim of a dragon dream and a bad feeling. And who? Jacaro looked at his wife. Minola, go home and... Something juddered under his feet for a heartbeat. Something that they all felt based on the wild looks that everyone sent in all directions. And then they heard it. The crashes as the doors to the great temple all started to slam shut, no matter who was caught in the doorways. Screams went up, some curtailed, some agonized, as whoever was caught by the doors was crushed in an instant or lost a leg or an arm. The doors in front of them swung closed, with no one pushing them, with a horrible suddenness and a terrible crunch, as they caught a tall silver-haired man between the leaves and killed him instantly, leaving the blood and debris to ooze down the outside of the doorway. They all flinched back from the gate, Jacaro pulling his wife desperately back and shouting for their guards to help him. And as Mara stumbled back, he looked at the blood pooling at the doorway and remembered the words of his youngest son. Something started to scream, a scream at the sky, a scream that made his mind hurt, and he looked up at the roof of the great temple, where the shutters were also slamming shut one by one. Oh, the sphinxes, all of the statues were unfolding on their perches somehow, and lifting their faces to scream into the sky. How was this possible? The crowd was running away from the temple now, howling in fear, and then a new sound could be heard, something strange and terrible. It was as if something was bubbling and boiling under their very feet, and then a black oil, or something like that, started to bubble up from the foundations of the great temple, before flowing somehow upwards over the sides of the building. As it reached each sphinx, they slumped back into their normal pose before reaching the very top of the temple itself. And then the screaming started inside. Ned? The mountains were red in places, the peaks not capped with white. This was the Dornish Marches, the place fought over so very many times by the Stormlanders, and the Dornish fought over until the ground should be dark red or black underfoot from all the spilled blood. As they drew closer to the place where the Tower of Joy had once stood, he found his mind filled with that last terrible battle of the war. A minor skirmish in the greater story of Robert's rebellion, but one of the most horrible days of life after that of the news of the deaths of Father and Brandon. The men had picked up on his mood, riding almost in silence apart from the occasional whicker from a horse. All men of the north, they were all sweating, and he'd heard quiet oaths about the heat, and he'd lagged to laugh and tell them, to their horror, that this was not even the hottest part of Dorne. Only Frostfire seemed to not feel the heat, and he wondered why. She also seemed to be unconcerned, and he had relaxed a hair, as he realized that they were not being watched. As the stub of what had been the tower came into view, he looked for the cairns, and then let out a sigh. They were still there, 2 on one side of the remains of the tower, and 5 on the other. He drew rein as they approached, and then he dismounted, threw his reins to Weil, and walked over to the graves of his friends. He was amazed that the cairns were still more or less intact. A few stones had fallen here and there, but they could have expected no less. Animals, perhaps, but at least not the more serious animals that liked Dornish scavengers or looters. No grave robbers had been here, and he thanked the old gods for that. Right, he sighed as he pointed at the cairns in turn. Lord Dustin, Ethan Glover, Martin Castle, Theo Wool, Sir Mark Raswell. Let's take them home, lads, away from this heat. They were good men. Treat their bones reverently. The men nodded as they removed their jerkins, and then with careful hands started to dismantle the cairns. As they did, he walked with Weil to the other 2 cairns. That one's when he was a relative of my wife, so he's to go back to Harrenhal. And that one's Hightower. Who needs to go back to the Hightower, as I promised? Weil knuckled his forehead and then started work on Hightower's cairn. As the men steadily demolished the cairns and then started to gesture at the bones beneath, Ned walked away and stared at the base of the tower. Gods, he hated this place. So much death. Pointless death, at that. 3 Kingsguard had been protecting his dying sister and her babe, and for what? What plan had they had once Rhaegar Targaryen was dead? Once the Targaryen dynasty was dead? What? He looked at the dust that had been stirred up by the demolishing of the cairns and how it billowed and swooped in the dry wind, and then Frostfire turned her head sharply and he looked in the same direction. There was a shape there in the dust, shaky at first, but then forming slowly. It was that of an armored man, with what had once been a white cloak but which was now smeared with blood and dust. He held his left hand over his right hand, but no sword was at his hip, no helm was on his head. It was Arthur Dayne, and he was almost translucent at first, before coming into sharper focus, and he was watching the bones being removed from the base of the cairns, and looking deeply conflicted. None of the men seemed to react to him being there, and then Ned realized that they could not see him. Only he and Frostfire could. He swallowed. Was this a ghost? A spirit? A vision? There was no threat. There could not be from the sad specter, and Ned made sure not to look at him. Only once the men were done, and the bones were bundled into separate and labeled bags, did he finally step forwards. Good work. We'll head back west again towards the Torrentine and then get passage down to Starfall and then on to Old Town. And after that home, he looked up at the sun. There's a cave half a mile southwest that should shield us from the worst of the midday sun. I'll join you there. I have some words to say at the place where my sister died. My Lord Weil started to say, but he cut him off with a shake of the head. Go! They went. Only once they were no more than several hundred yards away did he turn to the ghost. Dane. The specter of Arthur Dane started with shock and then looked at him. You can see me? Evidently, he said, the word dryly, his hand on the fist of winter. I was making sure that you were not a threat to my men. What are you? The dead Kingsguard laughed for a moment. I wish I knew. He straightened. The Sword of the Morning always swears an oath to bind them even in death. If the call is sent, the Sword of the Morning must answer. I was not the Sword of the Morning when I died, but I must answer it. I must. I swore oaths. I broke oaths. But that one is important. The others come. The Stark calls for aid. I am needed, even in death. He stared sadly at the man who he had once hoped would be his good brother. There is a new Sword of the Morning, and he has answered the call. I know, Arthur sighed. I was not the Sword of the Morning when I died. Dawn had rejected me, and there is no greater shame for any Dane than that. I was not worthy, but I can feel Dawn now, far to the north, and it's complete again. In a way I can't describe. Complete? Dawn was forged by a Stark who married a Dane. Our two families have been linked for thousands of years, but with time came distance, separation, dilution. Call it what you may. However, the new Sword of the Morning, Dawn feels as if everything is right again. He looked at the ghost. The new Sword of the Morning is Eddard Dane, Asher's son, my son. The ghost's eyes brightened. Ah, prophecy. He looked at the sad specter for a long moment. Arthur, why are you here? I died here, but I awoke after the call was sent. I had to do something. There was a need to help. He shook his head and then laughed softly. At least I'm not cursed, like the others. Something prickled at his scalp. The others, Arthur Dane looked at him. You shouldn't be able to wait. The ghost's gaze sharpened suddenly. You are different. I sense it now. What did you do? What is that mark on your face? Mark? And then he realized, I killed the drowned god. I had the help of the old gods, but I killed the drowned god. Then no wonder you can see me. You're different now. I can see it. Come, you need to see this. To see what? But Dane said nothing, as he strode across the dusty red ground and then gestured at the base of the ruins of the Tower of Joy. Ned stared, and then he saw it. There were shadows there, indistinct at first, but then, as he stared clearer and sharper, they started upright. Those of proud men in armor from the shape of them with cloaks. But then they seemed to shake as if hit by blow after blow after blow, blood shadows appearing and then disappearing as they slumped down into the dirt. And then the figures quivered, and he could suddenly see faces appearing in the ground where the shadows lay, the faces of Wend and Hightower, screaming at first, and then still in death, and then rotting into skulls, but with the mouths opening and closing in silent screams, and then everything in reverse before it all started again. Ned stumbled back in horror. Gods, what are they going through? Your sister cursed them. No, she cursed all of us. Arthas Dane's face was drawn with shame and horror. We held her down, Lord Stark. Rhaegar ordered us to, a command from a prince that shattered my oaths as a knight. But I still did it. I was a fool, a cruel fool. And when it was over, as your naked sister wept in the corner of the room, her hair over her face as she tried to hide herself in that corner, as Rhaegar tried to tell her that it was for the good of the realm, as Hightower stood there like a block of stone, and when wept quietly and I knew that I was no longer a knight, she cursed us. By earth and water, by fire and air, in the name of the old gods we were cursed, to never know rest, even in death, ever. He stood there, his mind ablaze in horror. He knew what they had done, but to hear it, and then the curse. That's an old curse, he finally said, forcing the words out. And a dark one. She was right to curse us so, Dane said, his eyes on the ground. 3 times Rhaegar dishonored her so, and 3 times she cursed us all. And he felt it the worst, because he was the target of the curse. The last time, afterwards, he ran from her. There was a long moment as they stood there, he shaking with rage, and then he paused. Why, he said in a voice choked with fury, are you not like them? Dane slowly raised his head, and then he raised his left hand from his right, and Ned realized that the hand that had been hidden was blackened and withered. Because Dawn started to reject me, I was not a knight. Not anymore. I knew what I had done. I knew what I had enabled to be done. The title of Sword of the Morning was being lost to me. I was not worthy. He hung his head in shame. Your sister knew. She suspected. She saw the slowly growing burn on my hand, as Dawn rejected my grip. And one morning I broke before her. I went on my knees and I begged for her forgiveness, and she granted it. Ned took in a long breath, and then he finally released it. Lyanna was better than I. Then he looked at the writhing shadows on the ground, and then at the melancholy shade of the former Sword of the Morning, and his nostrils narrowed. Are they in pain? In torment. I cannot forgive, and I cannot forget, he sighed. But I can find it in me to stop suffering. Wind, Hightower, go to your rest. I lift my sister's curse. The faces in the ground, which had just started to rot, both stilled, and then they seemed to sigh and vanish into the earth. He looked at the ghost to one side. And as for you, Lyanna forgave you, for the sake of your sister, who I loved, and our son, who I can't acknowledge, go to your rest as well. The sword of the morning has answered the call. Sleep, Sir Arthur Dayne, sleep, but wait, one moment. You said that Rhaegar felt the curse that my sister laid on you all the worst. He did, Dayne said as he started to fade from view. So, if Wend and Hightower are here, where they died, Rhaegar must be at the Ruby Ford in a similar state. Worse. Oh, far worse. Then go to your rest knowing this, me and mine will never visit the Ruby Ford. Some things can never be forgiven. And as the ghost faded from view, he mounted his horse and rode away. Mariner. Volantis did not sleep in the days after the great temple was sealed from within and covered in that terrible oily darkness. Volantis dared not sleep. The great temple was watched for any sign of that substance spreading. At least there had been no more attempts at breaking into the temple. One fool had ordered a group of slaves to pick up a great stone bench and try to break down one of the doors. But the moment that the stone had met the black oil, it and the slaves had been somehow pulled through the doors in the blink of an eye, before the screams had started. Brief screams at that. All too brief. Another, seemingly cleverer man had ordered that a wagon be filled with stones, taken to the slope that led down the hill to another set of doors to the temple, and then released. Once again, the moment that the rumbling cart had reached the oil, it too had vanished through the doors, like a stick through water. It was not normal. It was magic. And foul, evil magic at that. All agreed. The other temples in Volantis had all sent their most senior priests, and all had been left shaken by their first sight of the substance, let alone their second. One red priest, a tall man covered in flame tattoos, had been unnerved enough to call it a skin of evil, and to then admit that he could not vanquish it, as it was beyond his power. Something that was unlike anything that any red priest, who always claimed that their Lord of Light was all-powerful, he'd ever known, had ever said. So Volantis waited. Volantis watched, and Volantis did not sleep. Rosirnar had created a headquarters of a sort at a great inn that overlooked the temple. He had sent his family away for safety. He dared not put them at risk. The number of first families who were in the great temple was such that the city was almost headless. It was certainly Triarchless. No word had come from them. They must be in the Silent Temple, and with most of the first families in there as well, there were few left. He looked at the nearest sphinx on a nearby small temple. It was turned to look at the great temple. They all were. Very sphinx statue in the city was looking at the building, or more rightly at the oily film that covered it. Evil. That was the only thing that all could agree to. It was evil. But why had it chosen to appear here? And what had happened to the first families that were inside the building? Bendero, the high priest of Renar at the Red Temple here in Volantis, had told him quietly that he did not know what was going on in the Great Temple. He had sounded shaken about it. Apparently red priests could see visions of things in the flames, but in this case, Bendero could not, or rather, he dared not. There is an abyss in the flames, he had told him a day before, sounding like a man who spoke only because he had to, not because he wanted to, as what he had to say pained him. And there's something in that abyss, something that is watchful. There are eyes in there, eyes that do not want anyone to see deeper, eyes with claws and teeth. I cannot look more further, I dare not. He had been about to ask if this Lord of Light that Bendero so often shrieked about from the steps of his temple could surely protect him from these eyes, when Bendero looked at him again. One of my brothers dared to look longer than I dared. He sits now in a cell, in a puddle of his own urine, drooling, his mind shattered by what he saw. He will not live long. Something evil is in that temple, and it does not want to be disturbed. There had been a look on Bjornar's face that still left him unsettled, and he sighed and looked back at the great temple. And then he blinked. Bjornar, his brother emerged from the room nearby, dressed in armor and looking worriedly at him. He was as red-eyed as they all were, short on sleep. Brother, is it my tired eyes, or is there a change to it? Giriano squinted at it, and then they both recoiled as the black oily substance seemed to flicker for a moment, and then it simply faded away, like rain vanishing from under a lightened cloud. There was another noise, a great screech in their minds, and then the sphinxes all seemed to turn back to their normal pose on the rooftops and columns. There was a stunned pause, and then they were both striding out of the building, Marinar barking orders and Gareno shouting them to various people, as a nervous crowd of soldiers and others started to assemble around them. Marinar accepted his helmet from a slave, buckled his sword belt on, and then accepted a javelin from a grim-faced Gareno. He hefted it for a moment and then pointed it at the nearest doorway, which happened to be the one that the slaves had vanished into with the stone bench that they had swung. "With me, Volantine is..." It was hardly the most original or inspiring battle cry, but it fit the mood. The crowd followed him and he could see others leading men down the other avenues towards the great temple, their tread steady but cautious. As they approached the doorway, they slowed and he looked about the crowd for a familiar face, before finally spotting Bonero's right-hand man, Mokoro, who looked grim but determined. "Mokoro, here," the Red Priest approached, looking at him with a raised eyebrow. "What do you sense?" The white-haired man looked at the great temple and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he nodded slowly. "It is gone. Whatever was here, it is now gone. We can enter safely." He looked at the closed doors, and then he frowned. The wood looked strange, warped in places. He frowned for a moment, and then he pulled his arm back and hurled the javelin at the doors as hard as he could. It slammed into the right-hand upper quarter. It was not a bad throw for someone of his age. And as he accepted a new javelin from a slave, he frowned. It had gone into the wood further than it should have, surely. And then to his shock, there was a groaning noise and the gates slowly fell backwards into the temple. The sound of rending metal as the hinges gave way, making many wince. As he slowly advanced into the gateway, he paused. The hinges looked rusty, which was surely impossible. "Lanterns!" Gareno barked. "Lanterns! There are no torches alight in there." Lanterns were brought hurriedly, and only then did they approach the dark doorway. The air smelt wrong, musty in some terrible way, with a tang of something grimly familiar as they entered the temple. Death. They found the first signs not far down the passageway. The stone bench was there, on its side, and around it were the bones of the slaves that had swung it against the doors. He stared at the rags of rotted clothing that still clung to some of the bones and swallowed. How is that possible? "Touch nothing with your bare hands," Mokoro boomed, his face as pale as someone with his skin could ever get. "Gloves, gauntlets, wear what you can." "What do you fear?" Girano asked in horror. "We must take no chances," the Red Priest replied grimly. "Something sucked the life out of those men in an instant. We must be careful." That was sound advice, and after those who were without gloves obtained some, they continued on down the passageway that led to the great hall within the temple, where the altar to the gods of Valeria lay. As they walked, the smell grew worse, but not a bone or a body or anything could be seen. Nothing that anyone had dropped. No offerings for the gods. Nothing. They reached the hall at almost the same time as a number of other groups from the other entrances, one of which was led by Jacaro in his old armor. And what they beheld was a scene of utter horror. The outer pews were occupied by the dead. They were all slumped in their seats, eyeless skulls grinning where they could see over the pews if they were still attached to their spines. Here and there they could see some rotted clothing clinging to a rib cage. Men, women, children. They could tell by the size of the skulls at times, all dead, all rotted. The inner pews were bare of bodies, because the bodies were on the altar, or rather in the great structure of stacked bones and skulls that formed a platform around where the altar must be underneath. In the middle of it stood an empty throne, again made from bones and skulls. But the true horror was the thing that was sprawled at the base of the platform. It was a tall thing of bones and bare muscles covered in a tattered patchwork of skin here and there. Its head was huge and seemed to have several sets of eyes, and it was alive. It was breathing slowly and laboriously, as if fighting for every gasp of air. As the various groups saw it, they all did the same thing, stumbled to a halt in horror. "What is that creature?" Someone said the words with what was almost terror in his voice. The thing stirred, either at the words or the growing light in the hall. It slowly raised itself up on its great but trembling arms, and then the great head turned towards the nearest men, which included Marinar, who had his javelin clutched in one hand ready to throw. It had 3 sets of eyes, and something seemed to be set just above each set. He stared at it in utter horror. "Stand with me." The words seemed to jolt the men to life, and they all pulled out swords or leveled spears and javelins. The thing slumped a little and then looked straight at him. Its mouth opened to show deformed jaws and far too many teeth. There was a malformed tongue in there as well. Kara, Ez. He stared at it. "It speaks," someone muttered behind him. The thing shook itself and then pulled itself, trembling forward again. "Tyr? Bozos!" He shook his head in confusion. What was it saying? And then he caught sight of the eyes, and then the things between the eyes. Each set of eyes. Horror stole over him. No, but what if... His arm came back, and then he launched his javelin straight at the head of the thing. It sank into the great misshapen thing, and as it bellowed with pain, he called on the others to throw their missiles as well. Javelins flew through the air and sank into the thing, which shook with every impact, losing strength steadily. It made a keening noise, and then the others attacked from all sides. More javelins sank into it, while spears sank into the thing's exposed ribs. The thing bellowed one last time, and then it sank down and sprawled bonelessly on the floor. The twisted chest heaved once, twice as it gasped its last, and then went still. There was a long moment of silence as the men all stared at the thing. Was it now dead? Could anything live with that number of missiles in it? It no longer lives, if it can be said to have lived. It was an abomination in the eyes of every god, Makaro said to one side, his eyes still wide as he looked at it. What was it saying? It wanted to die, Makrenar said wearily. That's what it was trying to tell us. Look at what's next to the eyes. The red priest cautiously approached and stared at the malformed head of the thing, and then his eyes widened. Are the signet rings, a ring for each set of eyes, I think. I'm not sure, but this might be what remains of the Triarchs. It was saying, or trying to say, kill us. If he hadn't been standing in a charnel house of terror, looking at the thing that had been made from 3 people, he would have almost been amused at knowing that, for the first time in his life, he had seen total and utter horror on the face of a red priest. Robb, he wished that father was here. With him, he wished that Jon and Tion were with him as well, but he knew that they were still making their way back from the Iron Islands and, well, he could not wait any longer. Uncle Edmure should have been there as well, and Grandfather Hoster, but again, too much was happening in too many places, and he could not wait any longer. So he stood there, under the heart tree in the Godswood of Winterfell, with the blazing torches of his party all around, keeping away the dark of the night. Mother was off to one side, Luwin too, and both the castles, along with a misty-eyed Sansa, a smiling Demeric, and a very bored-looking Arya and Rickon. Hearing steps behind him, he turned. Val was standing there, her mother to one side and a glowering Morse Umber on the other. Val's silver hair was unbraided and hung down her neck and flowed over her shoulders like a waterfall, and she wore a brown and red dress with silver piping, the colors of the Umber sigil, that was modest but did not disguise the swell of her breasts. Who comes before the old gods this night? It was Roderick Castle who boomed out the words, and once again he wished that father was here to ask the same question. Vel Umber! Her grandfather bellowed the 2 words as if it was both a statement and a challenge to anyone who dared deny that Val was an Umber. Val of the House Umber comes here to be wed. A woman is grown, true-born, and noble. She comes to beg the blessing of the gods. Who comes to claim her? He stood taller at the challenge in the voice of Val's grandfather, Robert of House Stark, heir to Winterfell. Who gives her? Morse of the House Umber, who is her grandfather. Roderick Castle nodded. Lady Val, do you take this man? Val stepped forwards in an almost stately manner, her eyes fixed on Robb's face. I take this man. He took her hand and then one-handedly took the cloak that Jari has passed him and placed it on her shoulders before they both knelt before the heart tree and prayed quietly. After he finished, he looked up into the branches above their heads and caught sight of Quicksilver, who was watching with fascination before nodding her head at them both and then vanishing upwards. Vale looked at him, a little wide-eyed. I still wonder if she is a messenger from the old gods. Robb smiled at her. I'll tell you what I think, later. They rose together and then strode out of the Godswood, hand in hand towards the great hall, where a feast had been prepared. As they walked, he swapped a glance with her. She looked as hungry as he felt. He knew that some in the north would mutter darkly at his marriage to a wildling, but he also knew that her upbringing was one thing, but her Umber blood and open acceptance by the Umbers, they could do. I pull my nothing else in the face of Morzyumber's loud insistence, as well as the great John's agreement, would lessen those mutters. That said, with Sansa betrothed to Domeric, he would have to advise father that Arya and Rickon also marry in the north. Bran's marriage, well, he suspected that that would raise a lot of eyebrows, if Bran's future relationship with Quicksilver was as he thought. As they passed into the great hall and the assembled crowd cheered them, Valley leaned close to him. You ride to war soon, I can sense it. Soon, when the time comes. His wife smiled at him. Then we need to make sure that by the time you ride north with the banners, there's a babe in my belly. He looked at her and saw the naked hunger in her gaze, before pulling her close to him and delivering a searing kiss that made the hall echo with the roars of approval. Oh, we're going to break the fucking bed tonight. She smirked at him in an almost challenge. Really? Really? Then let's make the wedding feast short, husband, and bet on who breaks the bed first. He flushed and escorted her to the high table. Being patient was going to bloody kill him tonight, until he got her to their chambers. But by the old gods, he was married, and to a beautiful, clever, lusty wife. They had to enjoy the moment before the second long night came. Yeah, me. As it turned out, the Green Seer was not as weak as Leaf had thought, but he was indeed dying. The Green Man made that very clear. The Blackfish, Brycan of Tarth. The Green Man and Brynin Rivers met often, and afterwards the first three were always somber. He asked the Blackfish why they were so down in the mouth, and he told him that there was not a lot of time left, that much had to be learned, and that the others were moving, waking the thing that had created them. He still had a lot of trouble with that. The thought of something that ancient, something that was more than thousands of years old, that left his mind reeling. Perhaps Tyrion could have come to terms with it more easily, but to Jamesy it all felt insane. But then was not the word to describe his life over the past year. He had gone from a Kingsguard to a brother of the Night's Watch, to now sitting in a cavern under the earth with men and women who talked of magic and other things. Nevertheless, days passed, and still Bloodraven lived, or so he was told as the other three spent their time with the man in the world of his mind that could be accessed via the White Roots. Yaxme spent the time continuing to explore the caves, wondering at the things that lay within, the bones, the mushrooms, the old rust-pitted armor and ancient swords in one ancient cave that told that first men had been there, long, long ago. Some of the latter were made from some kind of metal that was studded with obsidian in places, and there was one that caught his eye. One that was gleamed and seemed to be whole, so he spent some time looking at it, marveling at it. And then, as he looked at it again, almost hesitant to pick it up, Leaf appeared and looked at him. An early attempt at what became the Great Blade, she said, eventually, with some sadness. Much blood was spilled, making that one. It has a brother, a more perfect one. The Great Blade itself, the blade of the sun rising, it was made here and then left here long ago. Carried by the one who speaks plainly, who lived at that the time. He frowned and thought that through. Do you mean as Stark, of House Stark? And the sun rising, do you mean dawn? Of what is now House Stain? Leaf smiled slightly. You begin to understand. Yes. The blade sings again. The blade the Stark carried. Yes, I hear it. In the south, it sings, like it is happy again, as if it has purpose. She paused and looked at what he held. Do you wish to carry the blade that you hold? He looked at it somberly. Why isn't it rusted, and why the obsidian? It was forged with magic and blood and dragon glass. But it was imperfect, never as good as its brother, but still, it has power. It was made at that time for a man who will come, not a man who had come at that time. She looked at him, eyes hooded. Hold it, with your bare hands. He looked at her for a long moment, stunned, and then he pulled off his gloves and pulled the blade from the old scabbard of rotted leather and wood that surely should have fallen apart thousands of years ago. For a moment he felt the weirwood handle warm under his grasp. Just for 2 heartbeats, or was that his imagination? That said, it had a good balance. It seemed well made, for something that was ancient. How could this be a brother Dawn which he had seen so often? Leaf looked at him again, one of those long and odd looks that she seemed to give him at times. You cannot yet wake it. He stared at her. I don't understand. You will one day if you can. Take it. Try and understand it. If you can, then you can use it. And then she turned suddenly, as if startled by something that he could not hear, and her face set. Come now! She ran off back to the main cave, and he swore to himself and followed, ramming the old sword into his belt and running to try and catch up with her. By the time that she slowed, they were both in the main cavern. Next to the weirwood throne that bore Bloodraven and Leaf stared at the motionless man. Then she darted to one side, pulled out a bowl, and then ran over to him. Eat this. Now. He looked at the paste and then reached out and hurriedly ate it before sitting and reaching out and grasping a white root. As he did, he could feel his head drooping as he slumbered, and then blackness for a long moment, and then he was standing in the throne room of the Red Keep again, and the others were there. From the light from the windows, dusk was falling, and he could feel that the room felt different than before. Not colder, but somehow tighter, more compressed. Bloodraven was sitting on one of the steps that led to the Iron Throne, his cloak drawn tightly about him, his silver hair almost lank and his eyes closed. The green man sat by his side, his hands on his knees, whilst the Blackfish and Brienne of Tarth stood to one side, holding hands, her leaning against him for comfort. Jaime slowly, reluctantly, stepped forwards and joined the Blackfish and his wife. How is he? He asked quietly. Oh, dying, Bloodraven said, his face drawn and sallow. He opened his eyes and looked at Jaime. I haven't had the chance to talk to you much, have I? There's been too much to do, too much to tell and teach. But now night falls and there is no more time. So, we must talk now. Bewildered, he looked at the ancient old man with the young face. About what? A smile crossed the older man's face, quick and wry. Leaf has told me about you, and I've had a look into your past. There have been times when you have been brave and done the right thing, and there have been times when you have been foolish and weak and done the wrong thing. Which is strange, because you have a brain. You're not like your brother, who is clever indeed, but you can be like your father, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. So, you need to choose. If, like Duncan here believes you do have talent, you do have something else that others do not, change. He stared at the man who had held so many roles in his life. I don't understand. Yes, you do. Become something greater. It's within you, just as it was in your brother. He rises to greater things. You share the same blood. You can too. I'm not as clever as he is. That's not what I am talking about. Bloodraven snarled the words, and then stopped and subsided as he reeled with weakness. The green man put his hands slowly on his back, and after a moment, Bloodraven nodded slowly and then looked back at Jaime. There is something inside you that needs to wake up. Leaf told me that you have taken up a new sword. Something I found in the caves. A failed version of Dawn? The others looked at him oddly, and he made a gesture of bafflement. Just a sword I found, made by the first men and left here. Left here for a reason. Maybe you can wake it. Maybe you cannot. It is a challenge for you. Set many years ago by the old gods. Rise to it. He stood there, feeling genuinely stunned. But nothing. There is no more time. Bloodraven was visibly weakening, his gaze rising to the darkening windows. I don't want to die. Ironic, isn't it? I wanted more time. But that is denied to me now. Brynden, the Blackfish, knelt at the feet of the dying man. I am here. You and your wife must carry the torch on. You are the lantern bearers. Much is up to you now. So much. Brienne joined her husband. I am here too. Your husband can be stubborn at times. Kick him in the shins and move him on. She laughed softly and then scrubbed tears from her face. I will always do that. Duncan? Yes? I should have listened to you more, and I wish that A could have lived longer. So much would have changed if he had. But now we have to play the game that is before us. You know what you might have to do? Night was falling, and the room was darkening. But Bloodraven's head came up one last time. Leaf will sing me to a better rest. Yoren Greyjoy. Beware of him, he waxes. I feel it. Worry not about my body. It is my wish as to what will happen. The old gods will have their due. We were born from the earth, and we return to it. Darkness fell, and suddenly Jaime jerked awake from where he was sprawled on the ground, clutching the root in one hand. Sensing movement from the others as they stood, he joined them as they stood around the great weirwood throne that held the physical body of Bloodraven, whose one remaining eye was now closed. And then Leaf stepped forwards. She was dressed in black, and as she walked forwards, she lifted her face to the stone roof above them all, and then she sang. It was a song of deepest, most profound sorrow, of loss that he could not even begin to describe, of mourning, the kind of mourning that he could not put into words. But interweaved into that song there was also something else, a kind of triumph at overcoming great odds, of becoming something greater. It was not until he felt the tears starting run down his face that he realized that he was crying, and even then he realized that he was doing the right thing. And then the weirwood roots that made up the throne started to move, started to writhe. He blinked at them in bafflement, and then flinched back as they covered the body of Bloodraven in a carpet of white. More appeared, more flexed in an unsettling way, and he stared at it all in bafflement. At which point the entire mass seemed to clench with an unsettling noise as many things snapped, and all of a sudden there was red all over those roots. He jerked backwards, and then the red vanished into the white roots, as if absorbed, before the roots started to just retract away from the throne to reveal nothing but the outcrop of rock on which the throne had stood. The Green Man and the others bowed before the rock, and Yami just stared at it. He suddenly knew that he had a lot to think about. Bran, he looked at the chair and pulled a face. He still didn't understand why Saintsir and Arya couldn't sit in there instead. But then he was also baffled about why it was that Robb was still in his quarters with Val. They'd been in there for a day and more, and he didn't understand why. Mother laid a hand on his shoulder, and he looked up at her. "Are you ready, Bran?" He nodded, and then he jumped into the stone chair and leant back against it. It was hard and stony and cold, and then he felt an odd warmth under him and behind him, as if the chair was somehow welcoming him. He frowned a little. Robb hadn't said anything about how it felt to sit in the chair, had he? Like, it being warm? A guard nodded at the doors. "Noon, my lady, my lord." He knew that there was a short chain of people from the courtyard to the room to tell them when exactly it was noon, thanks to Maester Luwin and some kind of device that was made of metal, with a thick bit of dark smoky dragon glass that was somehow see-through. He sat there wriggling a little with impatience. This was boring, and then the warmth blossomed again all around him, and he looked around excitedly. Was this magic? Could he feel the magic? The doors closed, as usual, and the wall in front of them seemed to come alive with the figures of men standing around the chair in the night fort where Uncle Benjen was sitting, only everything seemed to be happening faster and crisper than ever before. He blinked and he felt Mother stir next to him, along with the castles and Sansa. "Hello, Robb. Wait, it's young Bran." The king's voice boomed out, and he smiled and waved. "Hello, your grace. I've been told to apologize that it's not Robb, but he got married to Val the other day, and they've been talking or something in his rooms ever since. I don't know what about, but it's taking a long time." For some reason, the king found this funny, putting his hand over his face and making some spluttering sounds before turning to the other lords in the room and saying something in a low voice that made them all smirk or look away and laugh. Even Lord Lannister, who was a very scary man, who never smiled, seemed to get some extra wrinkles around his eyes for a long moment. When he turned back, he wagged a finger in the air for a moment. "You'll understand. Once you're old enough, talks like that can take a long time when the couple is, well, I'll leave it at that." Something crossed the king's face for a moment, like a shadow, and Bran remembered that his own marriage had not ended well. Uncle Benjen coughed from the chair, and the king looked at him, and then turned to look at Bran and then at Mother. "Well now, what news?" Mother stepped forwards and started to speak about what the ravens had brought them, with more volunteers who had heard the call arriving from Dorne who needed better furs, which were being provided, and other matters. It was all very boring, and he did his best to concentrate, but his mind kept wandering and he wondered what his friends were up to. After a while it was all over, and as he and Uncle Benjen both stood up from the chairs and the scene from the night fort flickered out, he looked back at the chair and ran his hand over the arm as the doors opened again. It was only then that he noticed that Quicksilver was standing in the far corner of the room, her eyes on him. "Oh, when did you arrive?" The others all turned to look at Quicksilver, and Mother directed an odd look at the child of the forest. "I've been here for a while. How did it feel?" "How did what feel?" "The chair." He looked at it again and then ran his hands over it. "Warm, odd. Why?" She looked at him in a peculiar way, and then she smiled a warm little smile that made him tingle inside for some reason that he really didn't understand. "Things are waking up." He frowned at her. "What?" "You'll understand." And with that, she flitted out of the room, running on silent feet. He watched her go, feeling baffled, and then looked at Mother, who had an almost equally odd look on her face, almost as if she was frightened about something for an instant, and then Mother shook herself and smiled wanly at him. By the time that they emerged out of the passage and back into the sunlight, he was feeling a bit cross. What was it that people were not telling him? He was old enough now to know what was going on and to not have people smirk over his head. Surely. And then he heard the sound of horns at the east gate, and he turned to look as a party of horsemen rode through the entrance. They were led by a man wearing a surcoat with the image of a fox surrounded by blue flowers, followed by a woman in a cloak who was looking about the courtyard almost urgently. He frowned as he tried to remember his lessons. Oh, was that Edric's mother? Robert! Talking to young Bran about what his brother was not that young Bran knew up to, no pun intended, left him with a slight case of melancholy afterwards, and he retired to the corner of the night fort where he had been doing his exercises with his log. The fat was gone, the muscle was back, but the skin on his belly was still in the process of shrinking back, and as he panted through another circuit of the training yard, he looked down and cursed himself yet again for his weakness in letting himself go so very fucking badly. Yes, he'd been married to an unfaithful whore who had preferred her own brother's cock between her legs than his, whilst he mourned Lyanna, but he still shouldn't have let himself go so very badly. That said, it had been too long since he had known a woman's touch. The marriage proposals were piling up, but he knew that he had to consider them most carefully, talking them over with Stannis. That said, gods, but he had a need. He panted his way through an extra circuit of the training yard to punish himself for being such an idiot, and then threw the log down. Only then did he see Oberyn Martell standing to one side, looking up at the wall and making notes whilst ignoring Selmy's cautious eye. He grabbed a cloth and wiped his sweating face and neck as he strode over to the Dornishman. "You seem very intent, Prince Oberyn." Oberyn Martell looked at him and then bowed. "Your Grace, I was observing the stones at the base of the foundations here at the Night Fort. They appear to have runes engraved on them." He looked to one side at the nearest wall. "Humph. Quite right. Winterfell has the same runes on the lower courses, from what I can see." The Dornish prince smiled slightly. "The first men must have thought ahead," he said dryly, before looking about. "A shame that the place has been so neglected, but I must admit that it is being repaired with great speed." That was a good point, and he looked about, and then grabbed a keg that contained something and sat down on it. Aye, the call was heard by many ears. "Did you hear it, Your Grace?" He shook his head with a grimace. "Oh, I think I was asleep at the time," that said. "I felt a powerful need to be elsewhere afterwards. Storm's End called to me most powerfully." He squinted at the Martell. "I take it that you didn't hear it." The Red Viper flashed him a rueful smile. "Not a word." Then the smile vanished. But there were those in Dorne that undoubtedly did. House Dane did, I suspect. Lord Dane left for King's Landing soon after with dawn. He stopped off at Sunspear and visited my brother. "I was there." He shook his head for a long moment. "The call was heard in Dorne. The stony Dornish heard it best, and that is all I can say." He nodded at that and then looked back at the night fort around them. "Thanks to the call, it's all being repaired. A shame that it was so neglected. I sent help to the wall before the call, but I know now that it wasn't enough." Oberyn, Martell snorted. "The neglect was long and started long ago, Your Grace. I know that you blame the Targaryens for much, but you can rightly blame them for this. At various times, various paranoid kings thought that the Night's Watch was the private army of the Starks. They were ever wrong about that, and now it was his time to snort. One of the first times I ever met young Ned, Lord Stark, I asked him if it was true that the Night's Watch was at his father's beck and call. He stared at me as if I was a simpleton, and then he explained everything. Then he frowned. "Do you really think that the decline of the Night's Watch can be laid at the feet of the fucking dragons?" Oberyn Martell looked around at the castle that was only now starting to see visible signs of improvement, before shrugging a little. "I would say so, but then who knows? I've seen some of the records brought here by Maester Aemon. They speak of indifference from King's Landing, and sometimes indifference can be the foundations of neglect. And then worse after that." That was a good point. And he looked about again before pulling on his shirt against the chill that was starting to seep over him. "Well, that's over now, at least." The Dornishman nodded as he completed whatever he was writing in the book in his hand, and then looked about. "Oh yes, indeed." And then a horn blew from the other side of the gates, and they both turned to see a party of men ride through, all in armor that seemed to have been wrapped in cloth and fur in places. They were led by a man whose silver hair, with a black streak, but youthful face, instantly raised his hackles as he was reminded of the fucking dragons. "Well now," Oberyn Martell said quietly as he dragged his hood over his head. "We spoke of House Dane, and now here is a Dane, Cedergarl Dane, the Dark Star himself. Even I must be wary. I wonder what he wants here." He was right to be wary, because Cedergarl Dane threw back his head and bellowed, "Where is the bastard that claims to be Lord Dane? He wields Dawn, the sword that should be mine. Where is he? Well now, this should be something to judge carefully." Axley. Winterfell was greater than he had heard. Was it greater than Highgarden? Well, he could imagine the querulous voice of Father asking why he would think that anything could ever be greater than the capital of the Reach, where House Florent deserved to be. But then Father could be a little fixated at times. Seeing young Edric had been an education in of itself. The boy was taller than the last time he had seen him, and with more bulk in his upper arms. He was still enough of a headstrong young lad to visibly want to run to his mother. The moment that he saw her, a huge smile on his face, but also now old enough to check himself after a moment and bow to her formally and stroll towards her, before breaking down and running into her outstretched arms. After a long and teary moment, he had remembered himself, and then introduced his friends to Delena, and what a surprising group they had been. Brandon Stark was perhaps not too surprising, but Robert Arryn was utterly changed from the last time that he had laid eyes on the boy at court. He was taller, no longer pale and sickly, and wonder of wonders, he no longer sounded as if he was a lackwit. Young Ned Umber was next, tall for his age already, and then there had been the hovering figure that was Shireen Baratheon, who no longer had the grayscale scars that had marred her visage for so long, and who had shed the almost visible cloak of sadness that had always been with her. Yes, great changes indeed. He had kept his head down, nodded to the right people, accepted guest rights with the bread and salt, taken Homefinder to the stables, avoided Soxley, and then quietly sent word to Ser Courtney Penrose that he needed to talk to him later on. Only then did he go to the quarters that had been found for him, and bathed and changed his clothes. When Penrose finally knocked on the door, he turned and held his hand out for the Stormlander to shake. "Sir Ser Courtney, Sir Orlakin, my compliments. Young Edric looked in fine form when I saw him earlier. He seems to be taking after his grace. His father, his shoulders seem broader than the last time I saw him. He has taken to the warhammer with a gusto," Penrose said with a certain wryness to his smile. "As I prefer the sword myself and the lance, I have had to ask others to help with his training." His smile diminished. "You wish to see me?" And now here it came. "Sir Courtney, have any Stormlords passed through Winterfell of late, or communicated with you?" Penrose frowned a little. "Few, if any, have come here. They tend to go north to the wall to answer the call or to talk to his grace. I have had a few letters, though." "Why do you ask?" He sighed a little. "House Florent has heard certain things from the Stormlands that have alarmed my father, Lord Florent, and I. Talk of 2 petitions that have been mooted, and which we feel you need to be aware of, if you are not already, as one could directly affect Edric." Penrose straightened. Not that he had been exactly slouching. "Petitions? What petitions?" This time the sigh was deeper. The call was heard in more places than many might have thought in the Stormlands. It echoed in many ears, caused many to seek out tales of their first men ancestors. The second long night is coming. The Stormlords want to be led through it. There has been doubt, that is the best way that I can describe it, about Lord Rensley Baratheon's ability to lead the Stormlands through this great test. The first petition that has been mooted would call upon His Grace the King to take on the rule of the Stormlands again. Penrose stared at him, his eyebrows flying upwards. "Good gods! And the second, for His Grace to appoint Edric as Lord Renly Baratheon's heir, as he is currently heirless, and perhaps cannot produce one, given his inclinations." Penrose leant back for a moment as though absorbing a blow. "Gods! Are they fools? Inclinations?" He pulled a sudden face. "Lorziers Tyrell," he said, the name as expressionlessly as he could. "You must have suspected." Penrose ran a hand over his face before nodding slowly. "I did. Servants in Storm's End talk. I did try to warn Lord Rensley, but, well, perhaps I should have been more blunt. For Edric to be pulled into this nonsense, though, are they fools? Will these petitions make it to his grace? I doubt it. Lord Yastermont has, according to father, been crisscrossing the Stormlands, presumably shouting at people. There was a pause as Penrose absorbed this and then nodded slowly. Then if Lord Yastermont knows about this, then so does Lord Renly. He winced. He must know that Edric has no part in this nonsense. He's too young, he's been here in Winterfell. The Starks would never encourage any of this. As I said, my father thought that you needed to be aware of all of this, as a matter of some urgency. Although Lord Yastermont will likely quash it in the Stormlands, and presumably Lord Renly will take his own measures. There could be some contacts from Stormlords who are more impulsive than others. Another pause, and then Penrose scowled a little. It might explain that letter from Lord Catherine that I received a few days ago, asking about Idric's education and training. I have not replied to it yet. I will think carefully before I do. He ran his hand over his chin for a moment, and then walked to the window, visibly pondering. Sarah Lecken, you have my thanks. Are you off to the Night Fort yet? It blinked. The Night Fort? Is His Grace no longer at Castle Black? Penrose snorted with amusement. If you wish to speak to His Grace, then just wait until midday tomorrow and join us all in a room in Winterfell. There is a chair here that, when a Stark sits in it, allows them to speak to a room in the Night Fort where there is another chair that needs a Stark to sit in it. Benjen Stark is at the Night Fort, and there are many Starks here, and there is a child of the forest in the Godswood. He stared at Penrose for a long moment. Was the man addled? And then he saw the absolute certainty in his gaze. Truly, is the Green Man, Sir Duncan the Tall, still with His Grace? No, he is on a mission north of the Wall. He swallowed. There is another matter. You might be wondering why Delina's husband, Sir Hosmund Norcross, did not accompany us. Penrose blinked. Yes, and here it came. Norcross heard the call, or at least he heard something. As you may know, Sir Courtney, the call was not always welcomed. It was loud at Brightwater Keep. I heard it at least, as did my father. Norcross was on his way to a tourney in the Riverlands when the call came. Based on the one letter that he sent to Delina, a letter that made little, if any, sense, he heard something that he came to regard as a challenge to his faith in the Seven, and he reacted as he, sought fit. Penrose stared at him, and then his eyes widened. He rejected the call. Based on what his squire told us, he sold his tourney armor as being too extravagant and bought the cheapest armor he could find as a mark of humility. Hedge knight armor, in other words, and then he sought out like-minded fellows who wanted to join the faith militant. He found some, and then he heard word of a Septon who needed swords on a great crusade against the old gods to conquer a village of heretics by the god's eye, who were denying the faithful access to boats that would allow them to get to the Isle of Faces and burn it down. Penrose's eyes were very wide now, and his mouth almost agape. I heard word of the charge of the Green Man, Sarah Brendan Tully, Brienne of Tarth, and other Green Men against members of the faith militant at the God's Eye. Norcross was there. He led them, and was killed by the Green Man, which is the other reason why I'm here, to disavow his actions. House Florent has nothing to do with what he did. His squire returned with his bones a week before we left Brightwater Keep, after many tribulations. Everyone thinks that the man who led the charge against the Green Men was a hedge knight. He was not. He was Delina's husband, and now Delina is a widow, and you can imagine how delicate our position is. Penrose still stared at him, and then he nodded. I understand. For Sorella, Balerion was concerned about something. She knew it. She could feel it, and that worried her a little. For the past 2 days, he'd been a little on edge, and both he and his father had been talking to Ned Dane, who had been bearing an air of strain was the best word that she could think of to describe it. Yes, strain. But a strain about what? What had got them so? On edge was wrong, too strong a phrase. Resignation was wrong as well. Just sad? Was that it? Or was that, again, too strong? She had to admit something else. She needed to decide what to do next, as she was torn between two competing needs. The first was to be here on the Wall, witnessing and recording history as it happened. The fate of Westeros itself was at stake here. But the second, she also wanted to go to Casterly Rock with Targaryen and his father. Because she was horribly sure now that she loved him. She could of course tell father that she was also seeking information on where Lorch was hiding, the pig-faced coward, so that he could receive the appropriate treatment once the war on the wall was over. But she knew father too well to think that he would fall for that. That said, at some point Lorch and the old lion would have to die. Just not yet. They had to be patient. She sighed a little and then looked over to where Alarina and his father were still quietly talking to Ned Dane. Catching sight of movement out of the corner of her eye, she looked around in time to see father at the door, gesturing to her. And she stood and swiftly walked over, driven by the urgency of father's gesture. "Father? What's amiss?" "Not so much amiss as... Well, the Dark Star is here, in the main courtyard, with some men. He's calling for Ned Dane. He claims that he's a bastard, and he's being the loudmouth fool that I've always known him to be." "Gerald Dane is here?" She looked at father, her eyebrows high. Father silenced her with a finger over his mouth, and then looked at the silent three who were standing to one side. "Lord Dane, I'm sorry to say that your cousin, Ser Gerald Dane, is in the main courtyard, and he is wroth with you." Strangely, Ned Dane did not seem surprised by that news. Instead, he looked at the Lannisters, and then set his jaw in that way that made him look almost like a Stark, and then he nodded to them all and strode out of the room, his head high, his shoulders back, and his spine straight. But his knuckles were white where they gripped the pommel of dawn. "This should be interesting," father drawled as they all followed Dane, the Lannisters almost at his shoulders like an honor guard. Father put his arm around her shoulders as they followed, and then leant close to speak softly into her ear. "There are tales about Dawn. An idiot ancestor of ours once tried to get the Danes to hand over the sword, as we lacked a weapon worthy of House Martell. Remind me to tell you the tale of Nemor Martell, a century before the conquest, also known as Nemor One Hand." And with that he released her shoulders and they walked out into the great courtyard outside. There was a crowd there, a crowd almost surrounding a tall man in his late 20s, with silver hair that had a black streak. She had seen the Dark Star before, from a distance, and as they drew closer, she realized that there was arrogance in his stance. And as he noticed Ned Dane approach, a strange predatory look that was almost cruel stole over his face. This, she realized, was not a kind man. Someone else was approaching, and after a moment she realized that it was Sir Barristan Selmy who was holding Stormbreaker. He brought it to the hulking figure who was sitting on a barrel, and as he stood she realized that the king was there as well. And he did not look pleased. "Aha!" the Dark Star cried as he pointed a finger at Ned Dane. "The man who claims to be Lord Dane." Ned Dane came to a halt, one hand resting on the pommel of Dawn. "Congratulations, cousin," he said dryly. "Your eyes still work, but perhaps not your wits." "Yes, I am indeed, Lord Edric Dane, Lord of Starfall and the Sword of the Morning." Gerald Dane seemed to swell with outrage. "You claim titles that were not yours to begin with." "Sir Gerald," the king said suddenly, his voice heavy with impatience and not a little dislike. "You imply much, but state little. Make your case at once. There are matters of far more importance that require my attention." The Dark Star came close to gaping at the king for a moment before he seemed to rally. "Very well, your grace. I accuse Edric Dane of being nothing more than a bastard whose title and sword do not belong to him." "That is a grave accusation," the king rumbled. "Prince Oberyn Martell of Sunspear, step forward if you please." Father strode forward, a serious look on his face. "Your grace," he said firmly. "Lord Dane, Sir Gerald." He gave the latter a look that was not exactly scornful, but which certainly had a certain weight. "My thanks. Please witness this matter on behalf of your brother, Prince Doran." The king turned back to the Danes. "Sir Gerald, your proof," he said, the last two words in a way that set the hairs on the back of her neck on edge a little. There was a warning in them, for those with the wit to notice it. The Dark Star seemed not to notice it. He smirked at his followers. A group of men, all Dornish, who all appeared to fit the general description of lackeys, lickspittles and hangers-on. Followers was the right word for them. "My father, a man who'd have been a fine Lord Dane, told me that Jaina Dane, wife to Alster Dane, had never shown any sign of being pregnant. And then, as if by magic, there was a babe in her arms. My father suspected that something was amiss and passed that suspicion on to me before he passed." Gerald Dane gestured at his cousin dismissively. "He is a bastard, and I think I know the truth. His mother was nothing more than a common maid, and while his father might have been Alster Dane, that still makes him a bastard, passed off as legitimate. He has no right to his title, or to the sword Dawn. Both are mine. He looked around and his lickspittles cheered as much as they could when surrounded by so many doubtful faces. Weak. It was weak. Why was he presenting a case that was so weak? And then she remembered what father had told her about the Dark Star once, that he was a vain, boastful, and cruel man who once he promised something to those around him, he had to try and do. What had he boasted about to the rabble that followed him? What had he promised them as he strutted about like a black and silver peacock with wilting plumage? And then she noticed two other things. The first was the looks that the wretched man was giving Dawn. Oh, he coveted that sword. Coveted it very much indeed. The second was the way that he seemed to try and loom over Ned Dane, to intimidate him. He was older than Ned, taller, more experienced in almost everything, and so he doubtless felt that he truly was more deserving of the blade. Ned Dane simply looked back at him with contempt written all over his face. My mother loved me dearly, and she was Lady Dane, so if you ever speak of her again with such contempt and such baseless lying words, you will answer to me. The Dark Star scoffed and his lackeys laughed. But the king glared and Sarah Barristan Selmy narrowed his eyes dangerously. There still seems to be a lack of proof, Sarah drawled. The Dark Star planted his feet and then placed a hand on his sword. I chow. Are you worthy of this sword, Sir Grold? Ned Dane took it from his belt and held it in its scabbard, level with the ground. Do you really claim to be the sword of the morning? Worthy of the sword, I am the Dark Star. You say that as if you think it means something. It might not mean what you think it means. If you want it, take it. But take heed of whatever your father told you about Dawn. If you are wanting, it will judge you. Judge me? The Dark Star laughed again. You speak of it as if it is alive in some way. This genuinely astonished Ned Dane, who looked astounded. Did your father not tell you about Dawn? He told me nonsense about snarks and grumpkins. He was a good man, but weak. Now, the sword... Ned Dane looked grim. If you can hold it, then it is yours. But hearken to my warning. If it finds you wanting, you will be judged, and you will not enjoy the experience. He looked at the expression on the face of his cousin, where scorn warred with incomprehension. Very well, so be it. And he held Dawn out to the Dark Star, hilt first. Ser Gerold Dane stared at the sword for a moment, as if he could scarcely believe that it was within his reach. And then he thrust his chest out, set his chin in a way that reminded her of a pigeon she had once seen in Old Town, and then he grabbed the sword by its handle and swept it out of the scabbard, a dangerous glitter in his eyes. He swung it through the air for a moment, looking like a cruel child given a lethal toy. And then he frowned as he looked down at the sword before letting out a choked cry. What? What is happening? What followed was something that stayed with her for some time. The Dark Star suddenly screamed, an ugly choppy noise that spoke of anguish. He fell to his knees and clawed with his free hand at the hand that was gripping the sword with white knuckles. Can't let go. No, yeah, gotch. Several of the Dark Star's acolytes darted forward to help him, but were stopped by the king, who turned on them and raised Stormbreaker. Hold! He wanted the sword. He has it. This is judgment. The Dark Star threw his head back and screamed again, and she was horrified to see that the hand that held Dawn was now black and smoking. Something was in the air above his scream as well. Was that smoke? And then the Dark Star stiffened, his face drawn with agony as he screamed again. There were dark marks on his face, and his hair was starting to smolder. It was horrifying and ghastly, and she did not know if she should look away or watch as this terrible thing happened to a man who had been warned but had not listened. She started as someone stepped close to her and placed a hand over hers. It was Anarion. You don't have to watch, he said hoarsely, as the Dark Star's scream became truly horrific in the man's agony. I can watch for you. Father will think I am weak, she said, wincing, as the Dark Star's eyes started to... No, she had to look away. She could not watch. She turned into Alarian's arms, and he held her as the noises peaked and then suddenly ended, replaced by the sound of smoke and flames. She buried her face in his shoulder and listened to his rapid breathing. Yes, he was watching for her. When, eventually, the noises ceased, she stepped away from him and looked into his face, which was pale and drawn with horror. He met her gaze, and managed a weak smile. It's over. Turning back to the place where the Dark Star had been, she could see that it was indeed over. Dawn lay on the ground, next to a charred spot on the flagstones that also held a mound of ash. A white-faced Ned Dane stepped forwards and picked Don up by its handle, before displaying it to all in his naked hands. One on the handle, the other on the flat of the pale blade. Does anyone now deny that I am worthy of wielding Don, as he was not? The assembled crowd, which was collectively just as shaken as she felt, shook their heads, and she could see that even Tywin Lannister looked taken aback. But one fool from the Dark Star's retinue raised a shaking hand. Witchcraft. No, the king said that one word in a voice like iron. Dawn is like Stormbreaker and the Fist of Winter, weapons of the first men magic. Dawn judged the man, and found him guilty. He looked down at the ashes on the flagstones. Prince Oberyn Martell, you speak for your brother. What kind of a man was Sir Gerald Dane? A cruel fool, your grace. Is Dorne satisfied with this judgment? It is, your grace. Then this matter is done. The king looked at the Dark Star's party. How many of you heard the call? The answer came in a number of furtive looks from some, whilst others looked baffled by the question. I see that some education is required before you all leave for whatever worthwhile destination you find appropriate. Those who stay and fight with us on the wall will be granted some degree of favor. Those that do not, will not. Lords Dane, your grace? Ned Dane asked as he sheathed Dawan in its scabbard and then hooked it back to his sword belt. A word. I also feel the need to have a word with Lord Dane. Your grace, father said as he tilted his head at her. We must join you. The king looked at them both for a long moment as he held Stormbreaker, and something seemed to pass between him and father before the king nodded and they all walked into the doorway that led to the great hall, whereupon the king stopped and turned. Lord Dane, your grace? When placed in a bad spot that requires you to be resolute, try not to set your jaw the way that you do. It makes you look just like Lord Eddard Stark, which is, of course, purely a coincidence, is it not? Ned Dane blinked hard for a moment. Of course, your grace. I will endeavor to set my jaw differently. The king smirked for a moment, looked at father, who nodded significantly, and then strode off, handing Stormbreaker to Sir Barristan Selmy, whose face was set in the look of a man who was trying to hide deep shock. Father watched them go and then turned to her. Gods, what a thing. Lord Dane, are you all right? You did not seem that surprised by the arrival of your cousin. I was warned, Ned Dane said in a low and troubled voice. By who?
Me.
And my father. The words came from Alarion, who had followed them. He pulled a face. Green dreams. We both dreamt of a dying star that fell to earth in smoke and flame, and died in horror. He closed his eyes for a moment. Father tilted his head. I think that you and I and your father need to talk. After you talk to my daughter, that is. He placed a hand on Ned Dane's shoulder. Lord Dane, you need a cup of strong wine. And then he looked at her. Talk to him, with my blessing. For a Lannister, he's... All right? And with that, the others walked off. Ned Dane shooting Alarion a look of thanks and encouragement. Oh gods, what was she going to say? What was she going to do? She was strong. She was a Martell. So, as he took a deep breath and obviously mulled many things in his head about what to say, she did the only thing that her heart told her to do. She reached out, pulled him close, and kissed him thoroughly. Oh yes, she thought as his arms came around her and held her. This was right. Robert! He slowly poured himself a cup of wine and then sat down in the chair in the Night Fort's great hall. Sir Barristan Selmy was standing off to one side, deep in thought and obviously not a little disturbed by what they had all just seen. Gods. A man had been burned to death in front of them, burned to a pile of ash, and by a sword. It was something out of legend. Surely. Something from the Age of Legends. Barristan, your grace? Stormbreaker, we already know that it can reject those who claim it, if like Joffrey less violently than Dawn did, but what else can it do? The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard pulled a face. Your Grace, I wish that I knew more than I have already told you. I have gone through the records that my cousin sent me, again and again, and all I can say is that, while the Selmys of the past were sword bearers of Stormbreaker, we were never its owners. House Durrandon bore the sword. House Durrandon understood it. And I very much fear that unless something is discovered in Storm's End that explains more about it, the knowledge died at the last storm. He nodded slowly. My father never talked of it, and whatever he did know died with him, like Ned's father and brother. That said, House Stark left something. But House Durrandon, what did they leave other than the tombs, the statue, and the sword? Perhaps a further search of Storm's End, your grace. Perhaps God's Barristan. I feel as if there's something hanging in the air in front of me, but I can't see it. I've heard the thunder that cracks about me sometimes when something happens, but I can't grasp it, understand it, control it. Gods damn it. He stood and strode to the window to look out over the main courtyard of the Night Fort, where shaken people still avoided the dark patch where that greedy cunt had tried to take what was not his. It might be your grace that Selmy seemed to search for the words for a long moment. Those who bore Stormbreaker knew what it could do and understood it so well that they felt that their successors could also feel it. It is no more than a guess, but the more you use the sword, the lighter it seems to get for you, and the more you understand it. He huffed and shook his head. But again, I am speculating. Perhaps when the Green Man returns you can glean some answers. He thought for a moment about using a heart tree to talk to Father in the past, and blanched more than a little. I feel as if experimentation is a bad idea, but how long do we have Barristan? Do we know? The Lord Commander of the King's Guard shook his head silently, and he smiled at the man sadly before looking back at the courtyard through the window. A rider on a blowing horse was coming in through the main gates, and he watched as the man all but fell from the horse, calling out for assistance that soon came. The exhausted horse was led away, and then equally exhausted man was directed towards the keep. A small knot of people growing around him, led by Benjen Stark. Something was up. It did not take long before there was a knock on the door, which opened to reveal Oakheart, with Benjen behind him besides the exhausted rider. "Your Grace, a message from the Hightower. From Lord Stark, Tyrell, and Hightower, in fact." He stood and waved them in. "What news from the Hightower?" The travel-stained man strode in and bent the knee, holding out a weary hand that held a thick leather wallet that bore the seals of 3 houses, Stark, Tyrell, and Hightower. "Your Grace, I have been sent from Old Town and the Hightower with an account of the events that transpired there." He took the wallet, pulling out a knife and cutting through the tight stitching that sealed the thing. Inside the wallet was a waterproof oilskin covering, and then another leather wallet, and then a thick sheath of papers. As he pulled the papers out, he looked at the exhausted man. "You look all in, man. Lord Redwine provided his fastest sloop to bear the news north. Your Grace, we were lucky. The winds were fair, and we had a fast passage. We were headed to the Shadow Tower, but when we heard that Westwatch by the bridge was manned again, we headed there, and I rode from there, hard, requisitioning a horse at every castle on the wall." The papers crackled as he opened them and saw the distinctive writing of his old friend, as well as other hands on different papers and gods. He looked up at the man. "Oakheart, get this man to the barracks, and grant him food, wine, and a bed. You've done bloody well. Your name?" "Hugo Flowers. Your Grace." The man seemed to wince a little as he said his name. He looked at him levelly. "Continue to serve me as well, and you will have a new name, Flowers. Think on it. Off you go." As the tired man stumbled off, he returned his attention to the mad tale in the pages of the report. There was Ned's words and also Tyrell's and Hightowers. The new Lord Hightower, and as he read, his eyebrows climbed and climbed. Gods. When he finally finished, he looked up. Benjen was almost vibrating with curiosity, and Selmy was looking at him with upraised eyebrows. As he handed the sheaf of letters over to Benjen, he looked at the guard by the door. "Fetch, Lord Tarley." At once, and then he strode to the window again, lifting an eyebrow on occasion as he heard the other 2 men exclaim in shock at the report that had astonished him. As he waited, he could hear Benjen and Selmy eventually go silent, probably again in shock. Not that he could blame them, it was a tale out of legend. And then finally, he heard a knock again at the door. "Your Grace, Lord Tarley." The door opened and Randall Tarley walked in, looking curious. "Your Grace, you sent for me?" He nodded at Benjen, who handed the report over to Tarley with a look of genuine respect. "The first report from the Hightower has come, as fast as was possible. It's quite a tale. And your son was there." Tarley stiffened and then looked down at the papers in his hand. "Simwell?" "Lord Tarley," Robert boomed, walking over to the Reach Lord. "May I be the first to congratulate you? Your son is now Sir Samwell Tarley, knighted by Lord Stark in the Northern Way for great bravery." Tarsley's eyes widened, and he stood there in what looked like genuine befuddlement for a long moment. "What?" he finally gasped in shock. "Samwell, knighted, bravery." "Read it," Robert replied with a smile. Apparently he said he was fucking terrified, but he still stood tall against Euron Greyjoy, holding Otherbane and standing between whatever that ironborn scum is these days and the gate under the high tower that held the drowned god. Stood tall indeed. Rid and be proud. As Tarly started to read through the sheaf of papers with the air of a man who had been shocked beyond words, he looked at Salome. Convene the lords again and get Maester Aemon in here. This tale of Euron Greyjoy leaving his skin behind whilst escaping. Gods, what is he now? The white-haired Kingsguard bowed, his face troubled before leaving at once. Robert looked at Stormbreaker, his brow furrowed. He needed answers. And he needed them now.